Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to The Bunker. In this video, I'm going to be talking about kingdom halls. That's right, the buildings where Jehovah's Witnesses meet. Specifically, I'm going to be asking the question, will Jehovah's Witnesses in the foreseeable future be getting rid of their kingdom halls? Because, of course, if you know anything about what's going on with Jehovah's Witnesses and their response to COVID, you will know that very responsibly, they have stopped meeting in their kingdom halls and they now conduct all of their meetings over Zoom. Now, as I've mentioned in many videos going back, this is an organization ill-equipped for the 21st century. And even before COVID, it was arguably struggling financially. We know about this because, of course, there was the infamous plea for funds where Stephen Lett as much as said, look, we have more money going out than coming in, so we need you all to donate more money so that we can, ironically, go and build kingdom halls. I made a video called Unrighteous Riches, thumbnail here if Tibor is gracious. I made this video that spells out exactly the conundrum that faced the organization because it seems they didn't get the money they needed and switched from wanting to build kingdom halls to wanting to sell them. All of this is explained in the video. They came up with this master plan that involved merging congregations, selling kingdom halls, and freeing up millions of dollars in cash. And again, in the video, I explain how we know all of this. It's been fairly easy to piece together using the organization's own video materials. So we're talking about an organization that has had to change its plans due to not having as much money available as it would like. We're also talking about an organization increasingly under scrutiny for its child abuse policies and having to commit resources to sticking with policies that put children in danger. We don't have an exact figure on what the organization has spent in lawsuit settlements and in fines over the last couple of decades, but it's surely a lot of money going into the tens of millions, we can only assume. This is an organization that is almost self-evidently struggling financially. Along comes COVID, and we suddenly find out that the organization can somehow get by without kingdom halls. And this is something where before COVID struck, if you'd said to me, Lloyd, there's going to be this pandemic and Jehovah's Witnesses won't be able to meet in their kingdom halls anymore, I would have said, okay, well, that's the end of the religion, because without kingdom halls, you can't have the Jehovah's Witness religion. How do you control 8.5 million Jehovah's Witnesses if you're not herding them together in windowless buildings twice per week with their children? How can you possibly sustain the Jehovah's Witness model of religion or belief without them congregating together in person? Well, they have surprised me. They've made it work. So the question now is, will this be permanent? Will they effectively take the money and run? Will they free up this unfathomable amount of money that's currently tied up in thousands of kingdom halls worldwide and use that for other things? Most urgently, almost certainly, disaster management, putting out fires that are currently raging and offsetting the obvious imbalance when it comes to growth in poorer countries in Africa, which I'll come to, being higher than growth in richer countries. This is a huge imbalance that the organization, in my view, has been struggling with for some time, because the poorer countries are the ones where there is growth. The richer countries are those where there isn't growth, but there is money. the money from the richer countries having to go to the poorer countries. It's just not sustainable. It's not a way of moving forward. I'm frankly surprised the organization has made it this far. We're now in 2021 and the organization is still, I don't know, vaguely recognizable as a global religious empire. But how much longer will they keep their kingdom halls? Well, I have put together a list of pros and cons for the organization selling its kingdom halls. I'll tell you now, the cons seemingly outweigh the pros. Let's first of all go through the pros. Pro or advantage number one, selling the kingdom halls would free up a breathtaking amount of cash currently locked up in real estate assets. And it would be a natural progression from the master plan. Again, as I explained in Unrighteous Riches, this is a strategy that to a degree they were already pursuing. Let's huddle congregations together. Let's huddle several congregations together in one kingdom hall, make 4 or 5 congregations share one building in some cases, and let's sell all of those spare kingdom halls and take the cash. Well, selling all of the kingdom halls would just be a next step from that master plan. So they already have the machinery in place, you could argue, to implement this. It's just a case of flicking a switch almost, isn't it? And again, breathtaking funds available to them if they so desire. Advantage number 2, money previously tied up in property maintenance can go straight to the organization for use in retrofitting the religion for the 21st century. It's not cheap to run a building, is it? It's not cheap to pay the electricity bills, the utility bills, whatever community expenses there are, fix the roof now and then, do all of the routine maintenance jobs and commit to all of the maintenance costs that are required over many years of running a building. Imagine if you no longer needed to spend all of that money. Imagine if that money could instead be diverted to making your religion information age proof, which is effectively what it needs to become. At the moment, it isn't. At the moment, you have a 20th century religion not built for the information age, built for an age in which it could write its own books and it could create its own flow of information that was difficult to challenge, difficult to debunk, difficult to research. And it's now completely a fish out of water in the 21st century because people can, within moments, debunk the religion's teachings online with a simple Google search or with a simple search on YouTube. Many of the most central practices and tenets of the Jehovah's Witness faith can quickly unravel just by doing a rudimentary search online. The organization wasn't built for this, and it's already trying to adapt, or at least since around 2012 when they launched jw.org, they've done their best to try and make themselves information age proof by effectively creating their own YouTube, JW Broadcasting, and doing whatever they can to control the flow of information, but they're failing. And the numbers show it. We had our first reduction in average publishers last year. Obviously, many will say that that was heavily influenced by COVID, but an organization that's doing half as well as they continually claim should have been able to weather COVID and not have a reduction in publishers for 2020. They are struggling and they need to come up with ideas. And I think one idea that they're committed to is churning out more video content. Video content isn't cheap to churn out if you're doing it to a reasonable or to a professional grade, which is something I know about myself as a YouTube creator. So I think they're committed to spending money in other areas. And if they can stop spending money on routine maintenance, on fixing broken taps, mending roofs, and instead spend that on camera equipment and stuff that's going to help generate more propaganda material, I think that that would be an attractive option for them. And finally, on my list of 3 advantages, the governing body have successfully demonstrated, as I said earlier, that they can maintain control of most members over Zoom. I say most members because, as I'm going to explain in my list of cons, I don't think it's all members, but mostly you have to say they have succeeded. They've pulled it off. They've managed to keep their religion going, and in some cases even increase control over members during Zoom meetings. Because if you're a Jehovah's Witness, how do you miss a meeting now that it's happening on your laptop or on your tablet or on your smartphone? What's your excuse for missing a meeting when, no matter how ill you are, nothing is stopping you from just logging into a Zoom call and just having it on in the background? What's stopping you? And we've heard accounts of elders sort of policing these Zoom calls and asking witnesses to turn their cameras on to make sure they're actually listening. This is all very invasive if you think about it. The pandemic has given the organization the opportunity to go into the living rooms of its members in a way that it simply had no reason to before. And yeah, this is going to be very attractive to the governing body. If they're thinking of getting rid of the kingdom halls, if what they're interested in is control, and I believe they are interested in control, they can't fear getting rid of the kingdom halls on that basis, because they've been able to demonstrate that they can keep that control and in some ways even increase their control, enhance their control over members. And I'll just add briefly, I've seen in my own family how this works. And I've seen in the case of my in-laws who are believing Jehovah's Witnesses, how they are almost more riveted by the organization now because there simply isn't a reason to not go to the meetings anymore. They are at all of the meetings, all of them. Whereas before, it was quite easy for them as an older couple to miss the meeting or to find reasons to not put forth that extra effort to get in the car and drive the 20 minutes to the Kingdom Hall. You can understand how that would have been harder than it is to simply click on a few links and, oh, I'm at the meeting and I'm with my brothers and sisters and we're all in this together. So I've seen in my own family the way this works and the way the control is continuing and in some ways even being enhanced. But I've exhausted my list of pros. We now go to the list of cons. What are the reasons why Jehovah's Witnesses wouldn't sell their kingdom halls? Reason number 1, the governing body will lose control over members who find themselves unable to engage in what would effectively be a Zoom cult, especially in the developing world, as I mentioned earlier, upon which it relies for growth. It's one thing talking about attending Zoom meetings in the Western world, in developed countries where most people have devices that make it possible for them to access a Zoom call, or internet subscriptions are easier to afford. It's another thing entirely to expect all witnesses to switch to this Zoom model in countries where the internet isn't as widely available, devices for using the internet or for accessing Zoom calls aren't as widely available or are harder to afford by the average person. And we've sort of already seen how this plays out Again, in the 2020 figures, if you look at many of the countries that went into decline in 2020 over 2019, they were African countries. And that's bad news for the governing body. They need Africa. If you don't have African Jehovah's Witnesses on board and able to worship, if you have African witnesses dropping off or becoming inactive because they can't follow along, you don't have growth in Africa. And if you don't have growth in Africa, you don't have growth in the religion. And if you don't have growth in the religion, you have decline. And I think the governing body is aware of this. If they weren't previously aware of it, they will be aware of it now, since we had the release of the 2020 figures, or since those figures came to their attention. So that would be, for me, almost a knockout blow, a slam dunk reason not to sell the Kingdom Halls for that reason alone. If you want to prosper to any degree, even if it's just a case of stagnant growth is better than no growth. And at least with the Kingdom Halls, you have stagnant growth, sort of incremental increase. You have something to point to. Without Africa, you don't have growth, you have decline. And that, for me alone, would be a major reason. That's going to be probably the reason why they wouldn't sell Kingdom Halls, or at least why they wouldn't wish to sell Kingdom Halls. Con number 2, irreversible and permanent downscaling of the religion to a shadow of its golden era. If you own a Bentley and you sell it and buy an old Nissan Sunny and you spend all that money, you're stuck with the Nissan Sunny. Unless you can somehow generate the equivalent value of the Bentley and go back and buy a Bentley if you tire of using the Nissan Sunny. Once the organization sells its Kingdom Halls and spends that money in whatever way it needs to spend that money, let's say putting out fires caused by its terrible PR image, caused by its child abuse policies, once they've spent all that money, that's it. They don't get to have another go. By selling the Kingdom Halls and spending the proceeds, they would irreversibly be shrinking the organization to, again, a shadow of its former self. So that would be a major reason, again, for not going ahead with this. Con number 3, nothing beats gathering together in person. Yes, you can have some degree of control over your membership by turning your religion into a Zoom cult, as we've seen. But nothing really beats that face-to-face contact, does it? I think that the organization will forever miss having that on a regular basis if they were to sell the Kingdom Halls and switch to, again, a Zoom cult. I think the whole experience of being a Jehovah's Witness would be forever diminished. It would lose a lot of its attraction because they need that sense of community, don't they? They need, for example, the love bombing. They need people to feel as though they're part of a collective. And yes, you can sort of have an imitation of that on Zoom, but nothing beats just being there in person. Con number 4. This was an interesting one. Decades of literature and video material geared to the Kingdom Hall model of worship becomes obsolete. I mean, think about it. Look at all of this literature written over many decades, all of which is describing meeting in Kingdom Halls and is even urging the need to meet together in person in Kingdom Halls, and describing meeting together in Kingdom Halls as being an intrinsic part of worshipping God. And it's not just the literature, it's not just decades of literature that describes this particular model of worship. Even the recent videos put out by the organization, which were filmed, before COVID, are all pointing people in that direction. Are, for example, showing Nita taking Jade to the Kingdom Hall. That instantly becomes obsolete, doesn't it? And harder to relate to if there is no Kingdom Hall that you could conceivably take a Jade to. So that would be a big con as well, wouldn't it? To render basically all of your propaganda material, decades and decades worth of publications, render it all obsolete and harder for Jehovah's Witnesses to relate to. Con or disadvantage number 5, it would be hard to sell this to the membership if you have spent decades convincing them that they need to donate their money to maintaining property, to maintaining their Kingdom Halls. If you're suddenly going to turn around and say, actually, we don't need Kingdom Halls anymore, particularly for the older members who've been giving so much of their hard-earned money to maintaining a Kingdom Hall in their locality that's for them to worship at, it's going to be a tough sell. And I think we're already seeing a bit of a backlash to this. Again, I mentioned my Unrighteous Riches video. That's had a lot of views, and I imagine many of those views will have been Jehovah's Witnesses learning about this scam for the first time and feeling utterly betrayed at the way, again, their hard-earned donations are essentially being underhandedly used. It's a tough sell, isn't it? It's going to be a bitter pill for millions of Jehovah's Witnesses to swallow if they've been personally invested in the Kingdom Hall model financially for years or decades. And finally on my list, the governing body and governing body helpers will almost certainly miss the adoration of large convention audiences. Although there is a caveat here. If they were to sell the Kingdom Halls, that wouldn't necessarily mean that they need to give up having conventions and assemblies. In fact, probably the conventions and assemblies would become more necessary than ever. Because if you no longer have any way for Jehovah's Witnesses to worship together in person, and you have something from the past that means that they can still do that at least once, twice, or 3 times per year by using a rented venue, or maybe even keeping the assembly halls running, I think it would make sense for them to do it that way. I think that would offer them a means of getting this adoration from the audience that they so obviously crave when they're going to conventions. You can sort of see it in their body language in the online convention, in the 2020 Always Rejoice. They sort of miss having that interaction with the audience and being able to crack jokes and have thousands of people in a stadium laugh at them, laugh at their jokes, and again, hang on their every word. If you're a narcissistic cult leader, you're going to resent being deprived of that. But again, nothing's stopping the governing body from continuing holding conventions and assemblies while selling off the Kingdom Hall. So I'm not really sure that is a con. It's just something that they would need to think about. Anyway, that's the end of both of my lists, both the pros and the cons. And if you ask me on balance what I think is going to happen, I have to think that it's inevitable. It's not a case of if, but when, that this organization eventually sells its Kingdom Halls. I think we're bound to reach a point, again, in the information age, where it's not even a choice for them anymore. They just don't have a choice in this because their organization has such a toxic brand. It has such bad PR. It's so difficult to sell the religion. And you have the younger generation waking up. I just see it as inevitable that what we're already seeing in terms of the downsizing of the organization, it's inevitable that that reaches a point where inevitably the Kingdom Halls have to be sold. Will it happen soon? That's another question. And the rapidity with which they do this, or how soon they do this, will depend largely on how bad things are. So this will always be their fallback option, their helms deep. If there is no other recourse, they know now, due to COVID, the governing body, they know that in an absolute worst case scenario, if they need funds and there's no other way that they can get hold of funds to put out fires and pay their expenses and fund their projects, they know, thanks to COVID, that they can switch to being, again, effectively a Zoom cult. This is their fallback option. It's there. It's waiting for them. And when they go for that option, we will know, okay, things are really, really bad. Because this is not something that they are going to do happily or gladly for all of the reasons I've outlined. Just because it's possible for them to run the religion without Kingdom Halls doesn't make it desirable. It would be, again, an irreversible shrinkage of the organization, and they won't be able to just go back to it at some future point. Once they've sold all the Kingdom Halls, they can't just flick a switch and suddenly buy thousands of Kingdom Halls around the world and just go back to the way things were. They surely know that. So when they do sell the Kingdom Halls, it won't be enthusiastically. It will be with quite some reluctance. And when it happens, we will know things are really bad financially. They're doing this because they absolutely have to, and they have been forced into a corner. So that's about everything I have to say on this subject. I hope you have found my thoughts interesting. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lloyd Evans channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.